Welcome, everybody. So my name is Mark Friedenthal. I am the founder and CEO of Tolerisk. We are a cloud-based solution for advisors to conduct a two-dimensional risk tolerance assessment process. So one dimension being the traditional personality-based assessment that assesses the client's willingness to accept risk. And then the second dimension is a cash flow-based analysis, which computes the client's ability or capacity to take risk. And then the two are combined in a scientific, nonlinear kind of fashion to make a simple, measurable, and actionable risk tolerance assessment, which is conveniently calibrated to be the numerator in a stocks to bonds benchmark. In addition, there's other supporting analytics that highlight the key drivers of the assessment, so you know exactly what drove each individual client's risk tolerance. You can see how it evolves through time, and you can also compute the probability that they will outlive their money. Okay, so that was my commercial. We're done with that. Since it's still early, and I gather a lot of people were out either at the 80s event or other things, so I'm going to go way off script here. I've never done this in a big group, but I will tell you my kids love this, and their friends do. They are in elementary school, but I'm still going to try it. So if you'll humor me, I know we have a lot of people in the room that are really good at math, so I think this is not going to be terribly difficult. This is something you're going to do in your head. Don't say it out loud. My kids call this Daddy's mind reading game, okay? So what I want you to do, I want you to think of a number from 1 to 10 in your head. Don't tell me what it is. Think of a number from 1 to 10. I want you to multiply that number by 9. Multiply your number by 9. If you have a two-digit number now, then I want you to add the two digits together, and I want you to subtract 5, okay? Now, whatever number you now have, I want you to convert it to a letter of the alphabet. So if your number's 1, you're going to make it an A. If your number's 2, you'll make it a B, and so forth. So you have a letter of the alphabet in your mind. I want you to think of a country that starts with that letter. And now I want you to take the last letter of that country and think of an animal. And I want you to take the last letter of that animal and think of a color. Okay? Now this is totally on your honor system. I want you to raise your hand. I want you to raise your hand if you're thinking about orange kangaroos from Denmark. Okay? All right, pretty good. And raise your hand if you had already given up. All right, okay, so we got a good number. So why does that work? It's really all about probabilities. We're going to focus on probabilities too. I want to ask another question. So for the advisors in the room, I want you to think about your clients that are, let's say, over 60, or your clients that are retired or retiring very soon. Think about them and tell me, what is the single most common question you are asked from these clients? I know you're all loose because of our orange kangaroo game. So somebody shout out something. What's your most common question for your retired population? Yeah. Am I going to run out of money? Will I outlive my money? That's exactly right. So what's interesting about how that's phrased? And you nailed it. Will I outlive my money? Am I going to run out of money? What's interesting about how that question's phrased? Anybody? It's binary. They're asking advisors if this is a yes-no question. Quick, am I going to run out of money? Yes or no? And we know that question, like a lot of questions in life, aren't so binary. There isn't a yes or a no. We're dealing in probabilities, kind of like the orange kangaroos in Denmark. So, you guys are probably all looking. I must have been clicking on this button here. Here we go. So here are some things we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about how risk tolerance assessment has evolved. We're going to talk about the common pitfalls, weaknesses, mistakes that advisors are routinely facing and contending with. So we're also going to talk about why it's important to improve your risk tolerance assessment. Basically, who cares? Why is this important? That's kind of you going to switch one? There we go. So down is forward, you said? Okay. We're going to touch on fiduciary standards and how that's kind of impacting things. A lot of that's obviously in flux now, so we don't really know. We're going to, if we have some time, we'll talk a little bit about mortality probabilities, that ever-popular topic that I'm sure you love to talk about with your clients, and some misconceptions, and how you can use a scientific risk tolerance assessment to really improve your service to your client, grow your practice, and things like that. So let's take a look. Okay, so how have things evolved? As I'm sure you're very familiar, the traditional risk tolerance assessment has been a one-dimension kind of exercise. Historically, it's been a few multiple choice kind of questions, and then the output has been categorical. right? Your client is aggressive, they're moderate, they're conservative, maybe a little something in between. So here's my clever little chart there, conservative, moderate, aggressive. Maybe you have a little more granularity. And so in the last 5 years, maybe to some degree 10 years, it's evolved a bit. We see things that are more numerical, they're more granular. Some would say that's a big advancement. Others would say maybe it implies too much precision, perhaps, but that's where we've seen it go. Cloud-based, a lot of solutions are cloud-based. You can operate them on the go. You can send your client a link. You can embed it in your website. So a lot of enhancements from technology. You can see we're still looking at a one-dimensional assessment. It's just got a lot more shades of gray or shades of color here on the rainbow, as it's really just become more numerical in its output. So on a scientific approach, as I mentioned, really you're looking at a two-dimensional assessment. Willingness we see here on the left side, ability across the top. So you see a lot more shades in this multidimensional process. Conceptually, when somebody has a high ability to take risks, personality becomes a big differentiator. You see lots of colors as you go kind of up and down if you're on the right-hand side. When they have a lower ability to take risks, personality becomes less significant. And that's why we say these are combined in a nonlinear fashion. Okay, so what are the common weaknesses in the typical assessments? Relying on nebulous nomenclature. So moderate. Most clients score moderate in these exercises. But that means different things to different people, even different advisors. What really is moderate? Switching between a few large categorical buckets. We'll talk about that. You know, if you just switch from aggressive to moderate one day and from moderate to conservative, you've made two potentially massive changes in your investment kind of lifespan. If your client happens to pick two, let's call them lucky days to make those changes, it could be great. And if they pick two unlucky days, well, you know, it could be not so great, let's say. Oh, so here's my example. Obviously, you know, it depends on the individual, but you can imagine that making those changes could be significant. So most assessments focus too much on personality. This has historically been true. Even the one-dimensional assessments, some of them have adjustments for age, so they'll kind of ratchet up the risk directive if the client's younger. They'll ratchet it down if the client's older. Maybe it's based on proximity to retirement, so they'll make those adjustments depending on how many years out retirement is. But they're linear adjustments, so it's the same adjustment in all cases. Oh, there we go. So let's take a look at some example clients here. These are obviously overly simplified, but so this client's young, 25 years old, retiring at 65. You guys can read. I don't need to read it all. But the noteworthy thing here is we're saying this client's got $225,000 in a taxable account. It's pretty good for 25, by the way, but that's what we did. In this case, their anticipated capital need is $200,000 in 2 years. So you know, in Kansas, that might be buying their first house. In LA, that might be the down payment on their first house. But we can see that their ability to take risk is very low because most of their capital is going to be utilized in a relatively short period of time. So for them, personality is going to be less significant because their ability is reduced. Client 2, same age, also another Wunderkind, has $225,000 put away already magically in his 401k. He doesn't have any, or she doesn't have any capital needs. So if that money's really going towards something long dated like their retirement, then their ability is very high. Okay, so we'll go back to client number 1, and I guess we're going to compare to a different client, number 2. So client number 1 had the big capital need. This one, so here's an example. This client's 65. They've just retired. They don't have any capital needs. They've already put their kids through college and bought real estate and those things. They've got the same $225,000 in the 401k. Here we look at their expenses, $5,000. They're covered by Social Security and a pension that's going to adjust with cost of living. So even though this client's already retired, their ability to take risk is very high. So it's really a function of chronology of cash flows there. Okay. Oh, so one of the other weaknesses in a lot of risk tolerance assessments is that you don't get an analysis of how sensitive the result is to the various inputs. So it makes it difficult for the client, let alone the advisor, to understand how we got to this risk directive, how it will likely change as these different circumstances change. And one of the things that's related to that is that if you don't know what drove it, you don't know which assumptions are most critical. And what advisors tell us all the time is that we ask clients questions, they don't always know the answers. And so part of the advisor's job, as they've shared with us, is we have to figure out which assumptions we need to button down and which assumptions we can kind of let slide because it's just not that critical. And so how many things, they obviously don't want to torture clients unnecessarily. Oh, so here, lovely. There's an example of this. So in this case, we have a client that their Toleris score is 73. So for us, this is calibrated to be the numerator in the stocks to bonds benchmark. So this would be a 73 would be a risk level of about 73% in stocks or other risk or growth type assets. The balance would be in low risk assets. So here we have, it's a little small print, but what you can see is we shock all the inputs up and down so we can see what those key drivers are. So here, it's a little bit spread out. We have a little bit based on when they're going to retire, a little bit based on personality, some of it is their age, and we have some smaller things as well. This one, if you'll notice, the Toleris score is the same. It's also 73, but they got there in a very different way. Got there in a very different way. Here we have huge sensitivity to age, huge sensitivity to retirement, everything else. Actually, the biggest one is retirement in this one, which was not on the last one. So understanding the drivers can be really helpful in knowing which assumptions to make sure you button down, which things aren't that critical. Here, we looked at their savings rate. Savings rate actually did not really have a big impact on this one, but in others it will. In others it will. By the way, that last chart, understanding the key drivers, can also help if the assessment yields something that's not intuitive to advisors. We had a call to our help desk one day last year where an advisor called up. I'm going to make up some of the details because I don't remember them all exactly. But it was a situation where they had a very young client who had a very low score. And they said, I don't get it. They don't have any major capital expenditures coming up. They're young. They weren't particularly conservative. Why am I getting this very low, very sort of conservative seeming score? And when we went to this kind of analysis, we call the sensitivity analysis, we could instantly see the giant bar was what we call rainy day funds. It's their emergency allocation. This client had said, I need 12 months of emergency allocation in case I lose my job. And they were spending, say, $10,000 a month. So that was $120,000. The client only had $100,000 in assets. So at that moment, it was really all kind of emergency funds. Now, as the client was saving and their assets were growing over time, you could see their Toleris score, their desired risk level or appropriate risk level was actually going up over time. So when we looked at the advanced age by 5 years, that was actually a positive number because they'd accumulated more. And so that emergency fund represented kind of a smaller component to them. Okay. I don't know what I'm going the wrong way. Sorry. Got used to a new clicker here. So about the analysis of the evolution of risk tolerance through time. So this is also something really helpful. Advisors tell us, in fact, this might be the most popular thing to share with a client, is that by making it rooted in cash flows, you can actually compute how their risk directive will evolve through time as they move through their cash flows, whether it's getting past some big expenditure like buying a house, or it may just be getting closer to retirement. It changes their ability to take risk, and thus the appropriate risk directive is going to evolve with them. By letting the client understand that, they feel a lot more confident in the process. They understand what to expect. People don't like surprises. They want to understand how things are going to evolve. This really helps them do that. So it's a way of building confidence, instilling discipline. That always leads to better behavior, better retention, and things like that. Yeah?
So how often do you suggest the client take it?
It's a great question. We actually don't have an official, recommendation, but I'll tell you, advisors tell us they tend to do it annually. Not everybody does. It is an intuitive kind of workflow, though. We have heard from advisors that use the more simplistic kind of personality-based profiles that it can be awkward to suggest revisiting it. The client says, well, you gave me these 10 multiple choice questions last year. Like, why am I doing this again? With this one, it's a little bit more intuitive because you may say, well, we don't need to update the personality profile per se, but we can go in and just refresh the cash flows. Let's confirm what you're saving and spending and what you have in assets and kind of what you expect for retirement and so forth. So it's a little bit more of a logical workflow, and it's a quick exercise to refresh something. It works. Ours works like any Microsoft product. Save as, make your changes, so forth. That's a good question. Oh, so here's an example of somebody as their risk levels going through time. This might be a more conventional guide path. Actually, I heard, I was here for the last presentation for Robust Wealth, and one of the gentlemen had mentioned a bespoke glide path. I love that word, bespoke. We don't use it, but that's great. So it's very customized. And one of the reasons that advisors like to show a chart like this to their client is it really emphasizes how customized. In this particular example, this client starts out with a tolerance score, a risk directive in the high 70s. It kind of gradually declines until about retirement and is relatively flat. This one is somebody it's flat right out of the gate. Here's one where, so here we have one that's relatively low. This is the example of somebody who's going to be pulling a lot of money out or a large percentage of their assets relatively soon. So you can see in the early stages, their risk directive needs to be much lower to account for that reduced ability to take risk with whatever they're pulling that capital out for. And then after it's removed, you can see it captures a much higher risk directive on the remaining assets because their ability to take risk on those assets is much higher, is a much longer average lifespan. And then later on, it kind of declines, as you can see, as they get later in life. So here's one. This is actually like the example I gave you of the young person where the advisor was surprised by such a low score. So you can see here, it starts out very low, where their rainy day money is kind of big relative to their assets, but it becomes much less significant as they go. As they save money and that money grows, their rainy day funds become much less a part of the equation. So why do you care? Why is having a better risk tolerance assessment important? So I like to think of it as kind of like a Goldilocks exercise. You know, you don't want the porridge to be too hot, you don't want it to be too cold. It's kind of like that with risk assessments. You got to have the right level of risk for each client. You know, if they take too much risk, it means they're either not going to meet some obligation, some financial or capital expenditure, or it means they're not going to stomach the volatility. Now, if they take too little risk, then they're not going to get as much enjoyment out of the fruits of their labor. And enjoyment is going to be different things to different clients. You know, for some, it's about when they can retire. For others, it's about how they can retire. And for still others, it may be about what they leave their children, their grandchildren, their charities, and whatnot. So a more scientific process really inspires confidence by the client. They're less likely to call you when the market dips saying, do we have the right level of risk? Are we taking too much risk? Because they've been through a very scientific process. They know that it's been customized to them. And further, if they still are feeling uneasy, it's very easy to open it up, refresh cash flows, and then either confirm that they've got the right risk directive or adjust it if that's appropriate. When clients are more confident, they exhibit better discipline, which we know is very positive for successful investing. That leads to better retention. They stick with their portfolio. They stick with their advisor. They also tend to make more referrals. So very helpful in that regard. Here's the other aspect, and this is becoming more and more pertinent, is that a scientific approach to risk tolerance assessments really support your fiduciary duties. And we'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. And also just promotes that strong kind of culture of compliance because you are demonstrating such diligence by including cash flows in the analysis of something so important as determining a risk directive. Yes, sir.
Do you have one risk number per client or per account?
No,
For example, if a client has a retirement account,
yeah, it's holistic.
long-term goal, you may have a different risk tolerance for that versus...
Right, so ours is holistic, so the tolerance score is on whole, but you're correct that advisors will sometimes say, well, we'll take more risk in the IRA, it's longer term, we'll take less risk in the brokerage account. We've actually had some requests for us to give them a quantitative split, which is something that is on our development queue, but not something that's presently available. Also a good question. Feel free if anybody else has any questions. Okay, so fiduciary standards, I know we started a little bit late, but I'm going to go fast here. So here, Michael Kitces actually did a great job articulating it, so I quoted him here. What he's saying is you've got two core duties as a fiduciary. Duty of loyalty, put the client's needs first. Duty of care, which I'm going to read it here. Duty of care is to provide diligent and prudent advice, and only in the areas in which advisor is competent to provide such advice. I'll also note the Fiduciary Institute includes an example of fiduciary care as eliciting from clients a sufficient amount of information at the inception of the relationship and updated thereafter periodically to make a reasonable assessment of their sophistication in investment matters and risk tolerance. So what these experts are saying is that you actually have an obligation, a duty to incorporate this into your analysis, cash flows, that you really can't ignore it. And I know advisors will often say, well, I ask questions about this, and that's important. But what they confess to us is it's a manual process. It's not reliably repeatable because it's more qualitative and manual. And so why they gravitate towards a scientific approach is we make it much more objective, repeatable, and documentable. That is a key. Okay, so mortality probabilities. Here's the big thing about mortality probabilities. Part of what your client wants to know is, will I outlive my money? And really, we said it's not binary. We really got to compute the probability that they outlive their money. So not only do we have to factor in their personality, their willingness to accept risk, all their cash flows, their ability to take risk, but we got to look at the probability that they are still around year after year, from now until any conceivable human lifespan. So unlike the traditional financial planning exercise that says, we're going to assume you pass away on your 90th birthday, TolerRisk actually looks at the variance of mortality and incorporates that into the equation. So we're able to actually even do it for 2 different spouses, so we can compute the second to die probability and layer all that science and math and boil it down to a simple, you've got an 8% probability of one of you or more outliving your money. Something easy that the client can understand. There isn't a right or wrong answer as to what that right probability is, but suffice it to say, if it's too high, nobody's satisfied. If the probability of running out of money is 50%, everybody is concerned. And the reason it's important in the context of risk tolerance is that an advisor doesn't want to give advice on something as important as a risk directive if it's rooted in untenable circumstances. So you got to correct for that first. The advisor is going to want to talk to the client about what's most practical. Is it working longer? Is it saving more, spending less? Is it downsizing some asset in retirement? You got to figure that out, and before you want to kind of base your other important advice on those assumptions. So some people, I hear this all the time from advisors that ask, so the probability of running out of money, that's kind of their ability to take risk. It's not really, and the example would be, and the reason, by the way, they find that kind of confusing is there are some instances where they coincide, where if somebody's spending too much money, yes, that reduces their ability to take risk, and it also increases the probability they'll run out of money. But you could have that young person who is buying a house with most of their money. They have lots of years to continue working and saving, and they're not going to run out of money because they're living very responsibly. But their ability to take risk now is low because they're saving for a house or they're buying it soon, that kind of thing. So this would be the example. Okay, so we show, this is our example. Our young person spends most of their money early on if you look at the left side of that graph, but they have lots of time to accumulate. Okay, so here's the important stuff. How do you use a scientific risk tolerance assessment to improve your service, grow your business, and so forth? So we talked about greater client or prospect confidence, about your customized wealth management process. It is the antithesis of a target date fund, which is obviously very generic. This is you customizing the risk level, not only now, but through time for your clients. So basically, your prospects are going to be impressed with how diligent and scientific your exercise is. Your clients are going to be confident in what they're doing with you. Advisors tell us all the time, regulators really appreciate that you've not only conducted an exercise that includes cash flows, but you've documented it as well. So really strong support for the SEC or other regulators. So what are our conclusions? Willingness to accept risk, personality, that's important. That's the traditional risk tolerance assessment, but it's not the only dimension. Very important to measure their ability. Sometimes advisors refer to that as capacity to take risk. We're using them interchangeably. The 2 dimensions need to be combined non-linearly. That was kind of my colorful little chart back a little ways. And then what's it going to add? We talked about improved conversion, more prospects becoming clients because they're impressed with your process, increased retention, increased referrals, and reduced compliance risk. So we can take a couple questions. I'll also encourage you to come by the booth. We're in the corner, booth 100, 102. You can enter to win a free 2-year subscription to TolerRisk and your choice of an Apple iWatch or a Samsung Gear. So come by, drop your business card in. You can also do a demo, or we can do it for you whenever you like. Any questions for me? We have a couple minutes. All right then. Well, thank you very much.